I didn't expect to catch anyone red-handed that night, especially not in my root cellar. It was close to midnight when my security alert buzzed, the kind I usually ignored because deer like to wander near the shed. But this time the cameras showed a flashlight beam cutting through the dark, moving with purpose, not panic. Someone knew exactly where they were going. My cellar door was open, the padlock dangling uselessly. That's when I recognized the voice echoing underground sharp, entitled, complaining to herself about violations. It was the HOA president. The same Karen who had fined me twice for weeds that weren't even on my property line. I grabbed my jacket and walked out quietly, heart pounding, anger keeping my steps steady. The cellar sat half buried into the hill behind my house, old stone steps leading down to shelves of canned food and tools. As I reached the entrance, I heard her muttering about inspections, about how she was authorized to look wherever she wanted. Authorized by who, I wondered, as I stood above her, listening. She didn't hear me until I spoke. Enjoying the tour? She screamed, dropped the flashlight, then spun around like I was the criminal. She immediately launched into threats, fines, lawsuits, board meetings claiming my cellar was a community safety concern. I told her she was trespassing. She laughed and said the HOA had jurisdiction. That's when I noticed her bag, already filled with photos and paperwork. She had planned this. I told her to leave. She refused, stepped deeper inside, and reached for another shelf, still talking like she owned the place. That was the moment something in me snapped. I walked back up the steps, pulled the heavy door shut, and slid the steel bar into place. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet night. She exploded with shouting from below, pounding on the door, threatening to ruin me. I calmly called the police and reported a break-in. While I waited, I stood there, listening to her rant echo through the ground, documenting every word on my phone. The minutes felt long, but I knew one thing for sure. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. And she knew it. The police dispatcher stayed on the line while I waited, asking routine questions as if this were just another quiet call. Meanwhile, the shouting from the cellar grew louder, more desperate. Karen's tone shifted from rage to panic, then back to anger, like she was cycling through strategies, trying to find one that worked. She demanded I open the door immediately, claiming it was illegal to detain her. I corrected her calmly. I hadn't detained anyone. I had simply secured my property after discovering an intruder. She didn't like that answer. She started pounding harder, screaming that she was claustrophobic, that she was injured, that she would sue me for emotional distress. I recorded everything. Her words echoed clearly through the ground, carrying threats and insults she'd never dared to say publicly. At one point she yelled that she was only doing her job and that the HOA rules allowed emergency inspections. I smiled to myself, knowing exactly what the bylaws actually said. I'd memorized them after years of harassment. The dispatcher informed me officers were on the way. I stayed where I was, leaning against the cellar door, feeling the vibrations of Karen's tantrum through the metal. She suddenly tried a different tactic, softening her voice, calling my name like we were old friends. She said this could all be handled internally and suggested we forget the whole thing. When I didn't respond, she accused me of extortion. Then she threatened to call the police herself. "Please do," I said through the door. That's when her phone rang inside the cellar. She answered loudly, clearly putting the call on speaker. It was another HOA board member. I listened as Karen lied without hesitation, claiming I had lured her down there and trapped her. I interrupted and spoke clearly into the door, stating my name, address, and that police were already en route. The call ended abruptly. Red and blue lights finally washed over my backyard fence. Two officers approached cautiously, hands near their belts, scanning the area. I explained everything, showed them the live camera footage, the broken lock, and the recording of Karen's threats. One officer raised an eyebrow and nodded slowly, clearly unimpressed by her behavior. They instructed me to unlock the door. When the cellar opened, Karen stormed out, pointing at me and shouting accusations before the officers could even ask a question. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and inconsistent. The officers listened patiently, then asked her one simple thing. "Do you have permission to be on this property?" She froze. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have an answer ready. She tried to recover quickly, pulling papers from her bag and waving them like proof. She claimed they were inspection notices, emergency authority forms, anything that might sound official. One officer took the papers calmly and scanned them under his flashlight. His expression didn't change. "These aren't warrants," he said flatly. "And they don't give you permission to enter private property." Karen's face flushed red. She immediately shifted tactics, insisting she'd felt threatened and had only gone into the cellar to protect herself. That explanation didn't last long once the officer asked why she'd brought a camera, a clipboard, and pre-filled violation forms. I handed over my phone with the recordings, including her ranting threats and the call where she lied to another board member. The officers listened carefully. One of them asked Karen to step aside. She refused, demanding to speak to a supervisor, loudly announcing that she knew her rights. The second officer calmly informed her that she was being detained for trespassing while they sorted things out. That word "detained" hit her like a slap. She tried to pull away, and that was enough. They placed her in handcuffs. The sudden silence was shocking. No shouting. No threats. Just the click of metal and her stunned breathing. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows, drawn by the flashing lights. Karen noticed immediately and tried to hide her hands, but it was too late. The image she'd worked so hard to maintain was unraveling right there in my backyard. One officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes, without hesitation. He nodded and began explaining the process, while the other read Karen her rights. She tried to interrupt several times, insisting the HOA would destroy me for this. The officer cut her off and told her to save it for a lawyer. Before they led her away, Karen looked back at me, eyes wide with disbelief and fury. She whispered that I had made a huge mistake. I didn't respond. I just stood there, calm, knowing the cameras were still recording everything. As the patrol car drove off, the officer handed me a case number and advised me to keep all documentation. He also suggested I contact a lawyer, especially given the HOA involvement. I thanked them and watched the lights disappear down the road. The yard felt strangely peaceful afterward. The cellar was quiet again, just stone and earth, no shouting echoing through it. I locked the door properly this time and stood there for a moment, realizing something important had shifted. Karen no longer had power over me. And this wasn't over yet. By morning, the story had already started spreading through the neighborhood. I woke up to messages from 3 different neighbors asking if the police had really arrested Karen at my house. Someone had posted blurry photos of the patrol car in the HOA group chat, and speculation was running wild. Some people defended her, calling it a misunderstanding. Others quietly admitted they'd been waiting for something like this to happen for years. I contacted a lawyer before noon. After reviewing the footage, recordings, and HOA bylaws, he told me something that made me sit back in my chair. Karen hadn't just trespassed. She'd violated multiple state laws, and her position in the HOA made it worse, not better. Abuse of authority carried consequences. Real ones. He advised me to document everything and stop all direct communication with the board. That afternoon, an official notice appeared on my door. It wasn't from the HOA. It was a temporary restraining order against Karen. The judge had issued it after reviewing the police report. She was not allowed within 500 feet of my property. I stood there holding the paper, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. For years, she'd made my life miserable with fines, letters, and surprise inspections. Now the law had drawn a line she couldn't cross. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that evening. I didn't attend, but I heard all about it later. Karen had been suspended pending investigation. Board members were scrambling, worried about liability, worried about themselves. Suddenly, no one wanted to claim responsibility for her actions. The same people who'd backed her before were distancing themselves fast. 2 days later, I received a formal apology letter from the HOA's legal counsel. They acknowledged the unauthorized entry and assured me policy changes were coming. Fines against my property were suspended indefinitely. I pinned the letter to my fridge, not out of spite, but as a reminder. Karen's lawyer contacted mine, asking about a possible settlement. I declined. This wasn't about money. It was about stopping the behavior, not just for me, but for everyone she'd bullied. The case moved forward. Weeks passed. The neighborhood grew quieter. The random inspections stopped. People waved when they saw me again, some with gratitude in their eyes. One neighbor even thanked me for finally standing up to her. I still check my cameras at night. Not out of fear, but habit. The cellar remains locked, undisturbed. Sometimes I think about that moment when I closed the door and waited, choosing patience over panic. That decision changed everything. The legal process moved slower than I expected, but the pressure on the HOA intensified with every passing week. Depositions were scheduled. Emails surfaced. Internal messages that were never meant to be seen started circulating between lawyers. My attorney shared only what was necessary, but it was enough to paint a clear picture. Karen hadn't been acting alone. She had been encouraged, quietly, by a few board members who enjoyed hiding behind her aggression while keeping their hands clean. That protection vanished the moment police reports and body cam footage became part of the record. One afternoon, I received a subpoena requesting my testimony at a civil hearing. I wasn't nervous. I had the footage, the recordings, the bylaws, and years of documented harassment. Still, walking into that courtroom felt surreal. Karen sat at the opposite table, noticeably smaller without her title and confidence. She avoided eye contact, flipping through papers she already knew wouldn't save her. When I testified, I stuck to facts. Dates. Times. Exact words she'd used. The judge listened closely, occasionally glancing at the screen as clips from my security footage were played. Karen's attorney objected twice. Both objections were overruled. The judge asked Karen directly why she believed she had the authority to enter my property without consent. Her answer was rambling and unclear. The hearing ended with the judge issuing a preliminary ruling against her. Trespass was established. Abuse of HOA authority was acknowledged. The case would proceed to full trial unless a settlement was reached that included clear accountability and permanent restrictions. That ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Within days, 2 board members resigned. A third announced he would not seek re-election. The HOA hired an external management company to restore trust, which was a polite way of admitting they'd lost it. For the first time since I moved there, the HOA stopped feeling like an untouchable force. Karen violated the restraining order once unintentionally, her lawyer claimed by driving past my street. It was enough. The judge extended the order and added fines. That incident alone destroyed any remaining sympathy she had. Neighbors began sharing their own stories. Surprise fines. Threatening letters. Intimidation tactics. I realized my cellar wasn't an isolated incident, it was just the first one that had been documented properly. One evening, a neighbor knocked on my door to thank me personally. She said she'd lived in fear of the HOA for years and finally felt safe again. That was when it hit me. This was bigger than me. And it wasn't finished yet. By the time the full trial date was set, the HOA looked nothing like the organization it had been before. The new management company took over day-to-day operations, and suddenly everything became formal, documented, and cautious. No surprise inspections. No vague violation letters. Every notice now came with photos, timestamps, and appeal instructions. It was clear they were trying to protect themselves from becoming the next defendants. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her lawyer filed motions to dismiss, to suppress evidence, to limit testimony. Most were denied. Each denial chipped away at the image she'd built for herself as untouchable. In the weeks leading up to trial, she stopped showing up to public HOA meetings entirely. When neighbors asked about her, board members avoided the topic or said it was under legal review. The trial itself lasted 3 days. I testified again, this time with more context. The judge allowed testimony from 2 other homeowners who described similar incidents: unauthorized entries, intimidation, threats of fines for non-existent violations. The pattern was undeniable. Karen's attorney tried to argue that she had acted in good faith, but the evidence told a different story. Emails showed her boasting about keeping residents in line. Text messages revealed her belief that fear was an effective management tool. On the final day, Karen took the stand. She tried to sound reasonable, even apologetic, but it came too late. Under cross-examination, her contradictions piled up. She admitted she hadn't notified anyone before entering my property. She admitted she knew the cellar was locked. She admitted she'd brought inspection forms with her before ever seeing the space. Each admission tightened the case against her. The judge ruled decisively. Karen was found liable for trespass, abuse of authority, and harassment. A permanent restraining order was issued. She was barred from holding any HOA position in the state for 10 years. Fines were imposed, along with mandatory legal fees and damages. The court also ordered the HOA to revise its bylaws under independent supervision. When the gavel came down, Karen didn't look angry. She looked defeated. Outside the courthouse, reporters approached, asking questions about the case and what it meant for HOA accountability. I kept my answers short. This wasn't about attention. It was about setting a precedent. Back home, life settled into a new normal. The cameras stayed up. The cellar stayed locked. But the tension that had hung over the property for years was gone. I hadn't just locked a door that night. I'd opened one. The months after the trial felt strangely quiet, almost unreal. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I wasn't bracing myself for the next letter, the next fine, or the next confrontation. The HOA newsletters changed tone completely. Instead of warnings and threats, they were filled with neutral updates, maintenance schedules, and polite reminders. The fear-based language was gone. So was the arrogance. New board elections were held under supervision. I didn't run, but I watched closely. The people who stepped forward were different: retired teachers, small business owners, parents who just wanted peace. During the first open meeting, one of them publicly apologized for what had happened to me and others. It wasn't scripted. You could hear the discomfort in his voice. But it mattered. Karen never returned to the neighborhood. Her house was listed quietly and sold within weeks. No farewell messages. No last-minute speeches. Just gone. Sometimes that felt more satisfying than any punishment. Other times, it felt unsettling, like a storm that disappeared too suddenly. But the restraining order remained in effect, and my lawyer assured me it would be enforced without hesitation. The HOA's insurance company reached out next. They wanted to settle outstanding claims from other homeowners before more lawsuits surfaced. That alone told me how serious the damage had been. Fear had kept people silent for years. Once one case cracked the surface, everything underneath started to show. One evening, as I was checking the cellar locks out of habit, a neighbor stopped by. He told me he'd grown up watching his parents argue with HOA boards in other neighborhoods and never thought anything could change. he said, seeing someone stand their ground and win had shifted how people thought about authority. That stuck with me more than the court ruling ever did. The cellar itself became almost symbolic. What had once been a place of intrusion and conflict was now just a storage space again. Shelves of jars. Cool air. Quiet. No voices echoing through the ground. No flashlight beams slicing through the dark. I reviewed my camera footage less often now. Not because I trusted everyone, but because I trusted myself. I knew the rules. I knew my rights. And more importantly, I knew that documentation and patience were stronger than fear. Every so often, I'd hear someone joke about not pulling a Karen when discussing HOA matters. It wasn't kind, but it was telling. Power without accountability had lost its shine. That night in the cellar hadn't just stopped one break-in. It had rewritten the balance. A year passed before I truly understood the long-term impact of what had happened. At first, everything felt resolved once the trial ended and the HOA restructured. But time has a way of revealing deeper changes, the kind that don't show up in court documents or news articles. The neighborhood didn't just become quieter, it became more connected. People talked to each other again, not in whispers or complaint threads, but face to face. The new HOA board invited homeowners to review updated bylaws before voting on them. That alone felt revolutionary. Clauses were rewritten to limit inspection authority, require advance notice, and mandate clear documentation for every action. Transparency replaced intimidation. When the final vote passed, it felt less like a formality and more like a collective exhale. I was asked more than once why I didn't run for a board position. The truth was simple. I never wanted power. I wanted boundaries. I wanted fairness. Those things were finally in place, and I didn't need a title to protect them. Karen's name came up occasionally, usually as a cautionary tale. People would shake their heads and say they couldn't believe how far she'd gone. What struck me was how often someone would add, "I thought it was just me." That sentence kept repeating, from different mouths, different houses. It confirmed what I'd suspected all along: her behavior had thrived on isolation. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from my attorney. It was from the State HOA Oversight Board. They thanked me for my cooperation and informed me that Karen's case had been cited in new training materials for HOA officers statewide. The phrase "root cellar incident" was now shorthand for what not to do. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of pride, but closure. Life settled into routine again. Seasons changed. The cellar filled and emptied as it always had. Sometimes, when I stood at the top of the stone steps, I remembered the echo of her voice shouting from below, the weight of that door in my hands. It reminded me how close anger and justice can feel in the moment and how important it is to choose the right one. The cameras stayed on. The locks stayed strong. But fear no longer lived there. What surprised me most was how often neighbors now came together to solve problems without involving the HOA at all. A fence issue. A tree dispute. Things that once escalated into fines were now conversations. Authority had been replaced by accountability, and it worked better than anyone expected. Sometimes change doesn't come from elections or policies. Sometimes it comes from closing a door and waiting. The anniversary of that night arrived quietly, without any reminder or announcement. I only noticed it because my phone surfaced an old clip from my security camera, labeled automatically by date. I watched it once, then turned it off. I didn't need to relive every second to remember what it had changed. The memory had settled into something steadier than anger, something closer to confidence. By then, the neighborhood felt normal in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Kids rode bikes without parents glancing nervously toward clipboards or cameras. People planted gardens without worrying about measurements or approval forms. The HOA still existed, but it no longer hovered. It served, quietly, the way it always should have. One evening, the new HOA president stopped by not unannounced, but with a text beforehand. He wanted to ask if I'd consider speaking briefly at the annual meeting, not about Karen specifically, but about homeowners' rights and documentation. I agreed. When I stood at the podium weeks later, I didn't tell a dramatic story. I explained process. Boundaries. How calmly following the rules protected everyone involved. I saw heads nodding, people taking notes. That mattered more than applause. After the meeting, several homeowners thanked me. One older man said he'd lived under HOAs his entire adult life and had never once felt like they worked for him until now. That stayed with me. It reminded me that accountability isn't loud. It's consistent. Karen never contacted me again. According to my attorney, she'd moved out of state and was no longer involved in any HOA work. I didn't feel satisfaction at her downfall. What I felt was relief that her reach had ended. Some people misuse authority because no one ever stops them. Stopping them doesn't require cruelty, just resolve. The root cellar remains exactly what it was meant to be. Cool. Quiet. Ordinary. Sometimes I stand at the door and think about how a place so simple became the turning point for so many things. Not because of what was stored inside it, but because of what happened when someone crossed a line. I still believe in rules. I still believe in community. But I believe more strongly now in knowing when to say no and when to let the law speak for itself. That night, I didn't trap someone out of spite. I closed a door, waited patiently, and let accountability walk in. And that made all the difference.